Well, thank you very much. It's a treat to be here with you this weekend. My name is Sean Mcdowell, and I actually teach at a university called Biola in Southern California. And I get to travel and speak a little bit. And about 3 years ago, I was at this homeschooling event in Cincinnati, and this guy about my age, maybe you know me, has dark hair, a lot of energy, came up to me. You ever heard of this guy named Pastor Jeremy? You know this guy? The first thing I learned is that he's cheap. Takes me to Taco Bell. Second thing, this enthusiasm for the church just starts, and love just starts bubbling over. And I thought, man, I'd like to get to know this guy. And he offered to bring me out. I said, absolutely, let's find a time and let's do it. But he asked me to do something very unusual. You see, I speak at churches, conferences, universities, schools, you name it. And one thing I love to do is something I'm about to do tonight. But I've never done this until the service before, in an actual church service. What does that mean? That means I'm about to put on my jacket, and when that jacket comes on, my worldview transforms into an atheist. That means I'm going to be defending the atheist worldview and inviting questions from you. Can you see why this is a little unusual for church? You see where this is going? Now, what's going to happen, I actually had a friend who, when I went to Biola, there's, 3,000 students, we'd have chapels. And they would be in the gym. And there's one chapel one time, and the reason I'm telling you this is because if somebody comes in late, can you tell them what we're doing? Give them some context. So I'm in chapel at Biola, and this guy was a missionary to Muslims. So he dressed up in kind of this garb that looked very Muslim. And then he's up in front speaking, and he had a microphone to invite questions from students, and he would respond as his Muslim friends respond. Well, this student comes in late in the back of the gym and doesn't know what's going on. So in front of the whole student body, he shouts at the top of his lungs, "This is not the house of Allah. This is the house of the one true living God." Awkward silence. Every time I saw him, I'm like, yep, that's the guy, right? So don't be that guy, and if someone comes in late, let them know what we're doing, all right? So you ready for this? So when this jacket goes on, by the way, I'm not saying every atheist believes what I'm going to say. There's variety amongst atheists, existentialists, nihilists, secular humanists, just like there's variety amongst Christians, okay? But I'm going to take one strain of atheism and do the best that I can to defend it. I have a lot of friends who are skeptics. I read a lot of books, watch their debates. I have a student I mentor. So I'm actually going to do my best to defend that worldview. Then the jacket will come off, and then as a church, we'll just say, all right, what did we learn? How do we best respond to these objections and kind of walk through what we just experienced in church? Okay? All right, Jeremy, you got the microphone out there, bud?
Yes, sir.
All right, he's got it.
Sounds like I'm rapping or something. What is going on?
Bring it on. So, when this goes on, I will become an atheist. I guess if I stop here, I'm an agnostic. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for having me come to your church. This is a very unique and different invitation for me. I get invited to debate sometimes. I get invited to university events. But this is the first time I've actually been invited to speak at a church service. So thank you for having me. I've often wondered why I don't get invited more. And it might be because I think in the minds of many Christians, I'm the bad guy, right? I'm the enemy who took prayer out of schools and is trying to change the definition of marriage and is corrupting the youth. So why bring him in and give him a voice? That could be it, but I think a better answer is this. As an atheist, I am a person of science and reason and evidence. I follow the facts where they go. And yet you and I both know that religion is a matter of faith. And faith is believing something, as Mark Twain said, that we know ain't so, or believing something when there's not evidence. That's why we call it a leap of faith or blind faith. So if you're a person of faith, why bring in someone who demands evidence for something? So I think that might be one reason why I'm invited in. By the way, I actually would believe Christianity if someone could show me that it's true. I would believe. In fact, if you could give me evidence that the Bible's true, Jesus rose from the grave, God exists, I'd be a Christian. Why wouldn't I believe it? The problem is I just don't see any evidence or have any good reason to think it's true. I find no good reason to think it's true. But that raises an important question for you. If I was able to show that there's no good reason to think Christianity is true, would you give it up? Would you follow where truth actually leads? That's an important question. You see, I actually grew up as a Christian. I went to a Southern Baptist church, and I would go out on evangelism trips. We had prayer meetings. I went on mission trips to feed the poor, and I would study the Bible. When I was about 17 years old, I had this girl who wasn't a Christian start pressing me with these questions I couldn't answer. And she asked me a few questions we could get into if you wanted to. And one of the questions, and in particular, my first thought when she asked me a question I couldn't answer was what my pastor said. My second thought was what my parents taught me. My third thought was what the Bible says. My fourth thought was, you know what, I'm going to actually look into this and see if it's true. And to make a long story short, when I began to read both sides and actually explore the evidence, I found that there's no good scientific reason to believe that there's a God behind the universe. There's no good reason to think Jesus is God. I'm not even sure that he historically existed. And there's certainly no reason to think that the Bible's the Word of God. Far too many contradictions and errors, immoral teaching like misogyny, endorsement of slavery, and genocide for it to come to a loving and holy God. So I walked away from my faith. And to be honest, it was one of the most freeing things that I've done, is to just be willing to follow truth wherever truth would go. So I guess I look at it like this. Have you all studied the ancient Greeks, like the Greco-Roman gods and their mythology? Have you studied them? Okay, good. Most of you are nodding. Remember when they couldn't explain something like earthquakes? What did they say was the cause? The gods are angry, right? Or they couldn't explain rain. What did they say? The gods are crying. No, gods don't cry. The goddesses were crying. But you notice their thinking, right? They couldn't explain naturally how earthquakes worked, so they inserted God in to explain something that they didn't have the scientific knowledge. It's called God of the gaps. But as knowledge has advanced, we no longer say the gods are angry with earthquakes. We know that it's something called plate tectonics. So we don't have to explain the rain by saying the god or the goddesses are crying. We have a natural explanation. You see, this is how science works. The more we learn about the natural world, the smaller and smaller the gaps become. If you want to insert God into that gap, that is fine for you. I have no problem with it. My problem is when someone says they think it's actually true and there's proof for it, and then they want to force their intolerant views on the rest of us. Well, I could keep going, but I think this may be a more interesting conversation. If you have a chance to raise some challenges, ask me some questions. What would you like to ask an atheist? Now, I'll just ask this. As Jeremy goes around, if possible, be as succinct as you can with the question. Now, if it's necessary, I will let you come back. I'm not here to filibuster. I want to give you a chance to come back, but I'd also like to give as many people the opportunity to ask questions as we can. Fair enough? I'll take that as a yes, that you speak for everybody. Okay?
All right, Metro, you guys ready for this? Anybody have a question for our guest?
And the idea is to spread out the questions so Jeremy has to run as far as possible.
I just have a question. Like, I see a lot of atheists on TV or whatever, and they seem to care so much about disproving our religion. And if there's no God, why are they wasting our time trying to convert us to atheism?
You know, that's a fair question. There's a Christian apologist by the name of Dinesh D'Souza, and he says, why do Christians try to disprove God if they don't believe in him? He says, I don't believe in unicorns, and I don't go around writing books called The Unicorn Delusion and Unicorns Do Not Exist. Well, the problem is he doesn't realize that it's religion that's caused so much pain and suffering and evil throughout the history of the world. Almost every war has a religious cause. Christopher Hitchens, who's a Briton who died maybe a year or so ago, he wrote a book called God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. He talks about slavery, he talks about misogyny, he talks about genocide, he talks about wars. It almost always has a religious root. So for atheists that care about humanity, to see the shackles that religion puts on people, to get rid of that is a liberating thing for them to experience. Just like if somebody was on drugs, I would want to free that person from drugs for their benefit. Same kind of thing.
If there is no God,
Okay, hold on. I can't see who's talking. Is that God?
It's
Okay, there you are. See, this is what happens. You hear a voice. If you actually look, you always find a natural explanation for it. It's a microphone. So,
how do you explain the creations of the heavens and the earth?
by the heavens and the earth, do you mean our actual earth and like the clouds around us, or do you mean the entire universe?
The entire universe.
Okay, fair enough. I don't believe the universe was created. Notice how we asked the question, how do you explain the creation of the universe? What does the word creation imply? A creator. I'm an atheist. I don't think the universe was created. I don't think we need a creation. I think there's a sufficient natural explanation. A better word would be the origin of the universe. Now, we know God didn't create the universe because that asks the question, who created God? Right? We say, well, God made the universe. Well, who made God? Well, God caused the universe. Well, what caused God? So we know it's not God. Scientists actually almost unanimously agree on the Big Bang model. Now, how many of you believe in the Big Bang? I'm curious. Let me see your hands. There's a couple of reasonable people here. Okay, 3 of you. That's good. Now, just listen. Alan Guth is one of the leading cosmologists of our day, and there was a show called Universes. And he said, if you don't believe in the Big Bang, you're a scientific crank. That's his words, not mine. Now, why would he say that? Because from so many lines in physics and cosmology, unanimously point towards this model being true. If you deny it, you have to deny so much of what science tells us and is delivered to us about understanding the world that we live in. Okay, so if you want my explanation for it, I actually think Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, gives a very powerful explanation. See, Stephen Hawking is one of the greatest living physicists in the world. He has like Parkinson's disease, or maybe not, some kind of disease that affects his physical impairment, but he's able to speak through a computer. And he actually shows that the laws of nature are sufficient to explain the origin of the universe apart from a creator. It's fantastic. I could go into some of the physics and the particulars, which I think might bore you and I'd lose the audience. But I'd say Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, he explains the universe scientifically without there needing to be a God. I think he's probably right. We lose the mic.
Hey, there we go.
Hi, you were saying like that you don't even think Jesus was a real person. Like, what about all the secular scientific evidence that Jesus was a real person? And
What secular? Okay, hold on. What secular sources are you talking about? Well, I heard someone say something. Who'd you say? You can help her out.
The Shroud of Turin.
Oh, okay, Josephus. Keep something in mind. Josephus didn't write until the end of the 1st century. But here's the deal. There is an alleged reference within Josephus to the historical Jesus. But think about this. Josephus was a Jew writing for the Romans. The reference says Jesus died on the 3rd day and resurrected. He was the Messiah. Do you know any Jew who would write that? Do you? Of course not. So why is that in the writings of Josephus? Because it was added later on by over-aggressive or excited Christians trying to make up for a lack of historical evidence in the early couple centuries of the church. So if you read Josephus, he's writing about a context, and then all of a sudden there's this reference to Jesus, and then it goes on. Because that section was actually inserted and not in the original. So I don't think Josephus is a reference we can rely on in any way early for the historical Jesus.
Hi.
Hi.
You say that Jews don't believe in Jesus, but isn't there Messianic Jews that do believe in Jesus?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by Jew, right? You can have a Jew by descent, somebody whose mom is a Jew, and that person, there's actually atheist Jews or secular Jews. But then you can have someone who's Jewish by religion. That's very different. Now, those who have a Jewish descent and believe in Jesus call themselves Messianic Jews. So, yes, they exist, but I was referring to Judaism as a religion. That's it.
Okay. Another question. What kind of confuses an atheist and might think, yes, there might be a God, I might be wrong?
What if, maybe this would help your question. You want me to tell you the questions that confused me that I couldn't answer at the beginning? Because atheists have different things that confuse them. I can't speak for all atheists. But I'll tell you the two that really hit me. Number one, how many of you believe there's one God? Let me see your hands. How many of you believe Jesus is God? Let me see your hands. How many of you believe the Father is God? Let me see your hands. How many of you believe the Holy Spirit is God? Let me see your hands. 1, 2, 3. Now, just stop and think about this. Christians always say, oh, it's a mystery. You can't understand it. If Jesus is God, that is one God. If the Spirit is God, that is two gods. If the Father is God, that's three. I don't know how to do math any differently than come to the conclusion that the Bible teaches there are three. So unless, typically what Christians will say is they will suspend their minds and say, well, logic doesn't apply to God. And that's where I say, if it's not logical, why on earth can I believe it? So that was one problem. The second one that stumped me, and I think this is a big one for atheists, is this. How many of you believe God is all powerful? Let me see your hands. How many of you believe God is all good? Let me see your hands. How many of you believe evil exists? So here's the problem. If God is all powerful, could God stop evil? If God is all good, would he want to stop evil? No. Most of you said yes, yes. And yet evil exists. So therefore, you can't have an all-powerful, all-good God and evil. Either you have to give up and admit that God's not all-powerful. Second, admit that God's not all good. Third, deny evil. Or fourth, admit that there really is no Christian God. I started to really think about these logically, and it just rocked my faith. And I couldn't make any sense of it. So those are two. Maybe that's what you're looking for. But I think the Trinity is contradictory. That shows that Christian God certainly doesn't exist. And then the problem of evil, logically, there can't be a God that's all good and all powerful.
I was wondering if you can explain how all the prophecies in the Old Testament, that Jesus fulfilled them all in the New Testament.
Well, first off, I would say I would need to know which prophecies you're talking about. So give me one.
That the Roman soldiers battled over, or for his clothes. That
Okay, let me ask you a
gambled
question.
over his clothes.
How many people did the Romans crucify? A lot.
Many.
Tacitus probably even, not Tacitus. Nero, probably thousands. How many of them do you think they bartered or cast lots for their clothes? All of them. It was a common Roman practice they would do to crucifixion victims. There's nothing special about doing that for Jesus. None at all. Next prophecy.
That he was born in Bethlehem.
That he was born in Bethlehem. First off, are you talking about the reference in
Bethlehem?
What's that?
He was to be born in Bethlehem.
Okay, so how do you know he was actually born in Bethlehem? As opposed to later Christians, when they wrote the Gospels, reading back into this account things that people said that would have to be true of the Messiah. How do you know that? And I don't trust the Gospel writers. There's far too many contradictions. They're totally biased, and they write late. So I think they went back and mined the Old Testament and then try to fulfill those personally and write those in and say, oh yeah, Jesus did this, Jesus did that. And by the time they had written, it was so far removed from eyewitnesses that nobody could verify it. I just don't think he fulfilled any prophecies.
All right.
Sorry, I'm about a couple of topics back when we were talking about the Big Bang Theory. And from what I understand of the Big Bang Theory is that all matter was infinitely small. and exploded, and that's where all matter comes from now. So where did that bang come from? Where did that matter come from?
I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. There was something called an infinite density within the singularity. But the problem is the source of that, we actually have something where, you guys seen that scientific experiment going on right now in Geneva in Switzerland that's like a mile long where they're trying to find the Higgs boson, what they call the God particle, right? This actually disproved the need for God because this particle bound everything together in the universe. Anyways, the point is, this can give us an insight into the early universe. But to be able to peer into the initial moments of the Big Bang, we would need an oscillating machine the size of the universe. Because there is something called Planck's time, which is 1 × 10⁻³ 43rd seconds right after the Big Bang. All laws of physics and nature as we know it completely break down. So you can't simply say, we know this is what happened and a God caused it, because we can't peer into those moments. Now, if you're saying God did it, then you're stopping scientific investigation.
No, I'm asking
this
you,
is what people
where
have done
did
in the
that come
past.
from, actually?
You're asking me something that no scientist has the capacity to view into and see. Human knowledge is limited to peer into, and we simply don't understand it. But I'll tell you what we do know.
Do you believe it's possible that it would be a God that could cause that Big Bang?
It's certainly not the Christian God, because it's logically impossible that that God exists. If we say the Christian God did it, then what do you need? You need an explanation of where that God came from. Third, what we do know is that something can come from nothing. We know that.
Yeah, I don't.
We actually know that. Now, how do I know that? This is what quantum mechanics shows. We see uncaused things on the quantum level happening all the time.
I don't believe that's true.
It is true. Are there any physicists in here? If there's any physicists in here, when we look at quantum mechanics, we see uncaused things happening and electrons peering into existence without a cause. I'll be honest with you, we don't understand why that happens, but we see it happening. So when it comes to the origin of the universe, if we have reason to believe that something can come from nothing, why would we insert God into it? Sometimes reality is very different than what our common sense intuitions would tell us. Very different. That's why people thought that the sun went around the earth, because it looks that way. They find out further and understand something deeper about the nature of the universe. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, I have a question. I have a couple friends who are atheists. They don't believe in God, but they think that there is a higher power. So my question is, what would be that higher power than God?
You would have to ask your atheist friends that question, because that sounds like a contradiction to me. If they believe in a higher power, they're not atheists. If they're atheists, they don't believe in a higher power. Can't work.
They don't have an answer for it, so they just think there's something higher in the universe than God.
We're going to have to clarify higher than God, but they don't believe in God.
Exactly.
Okay, your friends are confused. That's all I have to say. I don't believe that. Could someone give me any evidence that there is this higher power? Where's the evidence this higher power exists and I would believe in it? I just can't muster blind faith to accept it.
How you doing? Thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
Actually, there's just two things I want to jump back for a second also, but I'll stay on this topic. Questions only?
No statements, questions.
Okay, I'll make it into a question.
Let's start with one. Go ahead.
All right. I believe you just stated that scientists cannot explain. Thank you. There it is. I believe you just said that scientists can't really explain like the negative 4,200,000 gazillion second thing where physics doesn't really count. Like scientists can't explain how physics came to be.
I didn't say can't explain how physics.
Clarification.
Yeah, I didn't say we can't explain how physics came to be. I said there's something called Planck's time, the initial moments of the Big Bang, where the laws of physics are entirely different than they are now. It breaks down. Our ability to peer further into those moments is compromised, at least with our contemporary knowledge.
Okay, so then isn't that just your version of faith?
No.
Isn't
There's no faith in that.
No, I'm saying
Wait,
that-
what would be my act of faith? We know that. I mean, scientists are capable of peering down.
But you can't peer into it to know that the bang actually started. I understand that you can go back to a certain point, but after this certain point, doesn't there come a point where you just have to say, I believe this is what would have happened? Isn't that faith?
Well, first off, there's a very different kind of faith. There's one kind of faith that would say, I'm going to say God did this when there's no evidence or proof whatsoever. There's another kind of faith that says, I have seen natural causes explain things at every single turn that we're capable of peering into it. So when we come across something and it's stretching us at the present, why punt to a God when naturalism has brought us success every single stretch of the way? Every single way. That's a very different confident belief than a blind faith and assertion in the way that people bring God into it without any evidence whatsoever.
Okay, I think we differ on that. There's just one other question, I guess it is. You'd mentioned that the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are three separate, therefore three individual gods. Water comes in many different states. Water comes in liquid, gas, and solid, and it's still water. So my question is, how could that not be extrapolated, per se, by scientific terms?
Good question. Let me ask you this. You can have, say, a few molecules of water, and these molecules can go from solid, and those same molecules can go to liquid, and then those same molecules go to gas, right? So you have a certain set of molecules that go from one mode to the next. It's not simultaneously gas and water and liquid. It's the same molecules that transfer from one mode to another. If you apply this to the Trinity, you have a heretical view condemned by the church called modalism. It's heresy. And you're lucky that the church is not in control anymore. We'd probably burn you for spouting that heresy. Because it says that there's one person who goes from the Father to the Son to the Holy Spirit. But then it leads into absurdity because Jesus seemed to talk to God, didn't he? Jesus talks to the Spirit. So it breaks down when you start to apply it, at least to the way that Christians have classically taught and described what the Trinity is. So that's creative. I hear it from Christians a lot, and I think it's good that you're thinking creatively about it, but that will actually undermine your case and not strengthen it.
Ooh, now I have two. Can you say the word modalism in a sentence?
Can I say the word modalism in a sentence?
Just one more time. Yeah, that's my first one. Just modalism. I just like it. Just say it.
You just like want me to humor you or something?
Yes, just one. Can you do it?
I am at a church and the man is asking me to say the word modalism in a sentence.
It's just fancy. I'll let you think about it. This is my question. So, the Christians believe that God is all good and all powerful, right? Amen? He's all good and he's all powerful. However, he could control evil, yes or no, if that were true, is what you're saying. How do we explain then when the churchy guy like me comes and says, I was this raucous alcoholic, totally evil and ruthless for years and years and years, and I got down on my knees and I asked for help one time as I was about to just pillage my grandmother's house again. And I used that evil, God used that evil. You could say because that's what the theorists would say, but that evil was used for 18 years of goodness to help other people.
So,
you could say that I did that, but even the medical definition of alcoholism says that there is this antibody in us that says that we have no choice to drink. Now, some would disagree with that. Some religious people would. But I believe we have no choice but to drink. No choice. How do we explain that?
So you don't believe in free will? If we have no choice? Look, this is an interesting thing to me. And I'm actually glad, in your case, that religion helped you deal with this. I think that's wonderful. It's amazing. I have Mormon friends, and their Mormon faith has helped them through alcohol. I have Muslim friends. Their faith and their community has helped them through things. I don't think that proves there's actually a God. I think it proves that humans have evolved in a certain way in the struggle for survival, that certain social things and relationships, if we believe certain things exist, it's called a placebo effect, it's going to actually help us to conquer them. So I'm happy for you. I think that's wonderful that religion has played that role in your life, but I don't see any reason why that means God actually exists. I mean, look at my New Age friends tell me the same thing. But good for you. Not a fan. Go ahead.
A great format, by the way. I know who we say Jesus is, but who do you say that Jesus is? Or
I don't know that he honestly existed. I think he's a mythical tale that's been made up.
So then I would ask, what year is it?
I'm pretty sure it's 2013.
And you're going to say before BCE, before the Common Era, as we would say before Christ, or AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. But we would both just agree that 2,000 years ago, something happened to change the course of time that everybody in the whole world
No, I don't
agrees
think
on.
it changed the course of time. I think there was a story that was mythical. It was made up. It's been accepted and believed around the time of Constantine. People, even in the 300s, 400s, 500s, weren't saying, oh, it's the year 340. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that people looked back and started calling things specific years. That has no evidence whatsoever that those things happened. It's just because a story had so taken root in people's lives.
Which story about
and
which kind?
It's a mythical story.
But what's the common denominator of that story?
I mean, if you ask a Muslim, you go 20 minutes to Dearborn what year it is, they're going to base the year upon what they call not the hijab, the hijra, when Muhammad and some of his followers left Mecca and went up to Medina. That's how they judge the year. Does that mean Islam is true?
So you would disagree with Irenaeus and Tacitus and Origen and all those, and Josephus even for that matter. I don't know what you said earlier was actually true. I would love to see where you thought where Josephus all of a sudden altered the antiquities. And that, so all those guys in the 1st and 2nd century, they just wrote about this mythical guy, Origen, Tacitus. Even Tacitus wasn't even a Christian or a religious guy, right?
Are you talking about Tacitus?
Tacitus, thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
No, he was a Roman writer in the 2nd century.
Correct.
Probably 80 years removed, in the 3rd generation after Christ allegedly lived. One reference, and by the way, Josephus referred to at least 30 people called Jesus. There were multiple false Christs. I don't even know that Tacitus is talking about the person that people think was Jesus Christ. Only by reading into it would any Christian consider that reliable evidence.
I don't know if I can. Anyway, one last question though. Did you ever read this book that said?
Yeah, I know where this is going.
Yeah,
all right,
Evidence that demands verdict.
I know it every time.
This
Someone
great
thinks
guy,
they're so
Josh
creative.
McDowell, wrote it.
Coming out of character. All right. Every time. All right, that was fun. This is kind of a reserved clapping, a little nervous. Now, I want you to do something. I want a scale of 1 to 10. I want you to rate in your mind how prepared you were to ask tough questions and defend your faith when I came after you. In your own mind. 10 meaning I owned that atheist in love, of course. 1 meaning I got destroyed and everything in between. How would you rate yourself? Because 1 Peter 3:15 says, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be prepared to give an answer when someone asks you, and do it with gentleness and do it with respect. Whether you asked a question or not, how ready were you? By the way, you know who that passage applies to? All Christians. Not just pastors, not just teachers, everybody. All Christians are called. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how prepared do you think you were to defend your faith? Now, one of the things I want to do is I kind of like to beat up on Christians a little bit because I want you to feel what it's like to not be prepared and to hear stuff you haven't heard before. Why? Because I have a lot of students who I've taught over the years. They get to university, and you know in the university there's 2 to 3 times as many atheists and agnostics than in the public as a whole. They have a professor who starts challenging them like this. They don't have an answer. They're away from home, away from their community. And it starts to rock them a little bit. And studies show between 40 and 60% of young people who say they believe in Jesus in their senior year in high school will disengage the church, and many will not come back. Now, there's a lot of reasons a kid can walk away, but a huge reason is they're just not prepared to give an answer. So I do this with students, and I say, I wanted to rock you a little bit before you get into campus and it happens to you, or you get out in the workplace and somebody challenges you, by a Christian who, by the way, didn't believe anything I just said. You know that, right? I don't believe any of that stuff. I'm a Christian, all right? So just so you know, if you're sitting there going, man, I'm not sure what to make sense of this stuff, I'm a Christian. It's not because I have blind faith. It's because I've thought about it, and I've read both sides, and I've examined the evidence, and I really think that Christianity is true. So I wanted to shake you up a little bit, especially Christians, and just think, how prepared am I? Because young people today are grown up in a totally different culture. And if we don't prepare them to know what they believe and why, they'll walk away. But this isn't just about students. This is about us in the workplace. We are called to be ready with an answer. Right? If you're living Christianly, someone's going to ask you, it's just going to come out of nowhere, hey, why do you believe in the Bible? Do you really believe Jesus is God? What do you think about the issue of pro-life? And that's when we've studied and we're ready, we can give an intelligent answer. And God can use us powerfully. All of us need to be ready with an answer. Now, usually I spend time talking about, I'm not going to go into much depth here because you guys were loving. I think some of you went to the first, how many of you were in the first session and hungover? I don't mean you're hungover from the first session. Okay, sorry, what's your name? No, I'm just kidding. Now, usually when I do this, I wish you could be a fly on the wall. It's amazing to me the way that I will get treated by Christians in character, and they know I'm not an atheist. It's unbelievable. Now, you have an amazing pastor who really teaches you to love people and to engage in others with a different belief system. And I'll just tell you one quick story, and then we're going to make sense of some of these questions. I wrote a book called Is God Just a Human Invention? And the whole point, by the way, was to answer everything I threw at you. I basically go back and answer on the other side of this book. Because I saw so many people getting challenged by beliefs and not being ready with an answer. So I got it, and I decided to call it the largest free-thinking atheist group in Southern California. I said, hey, my name's Sean Mcdowell. I wrote this book. I'll bring free copies for everybody and sit in the hot seat for a couple hours if you guys just want to have a conversation about God. You can ask me anything. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a lot of fun to me. I'm not going to pretend for half a second I have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. I know that very clearly. But I just wanted to build some common ground with them. And at the end, I could have asked them the tough questions that you asked me. And you guys asked some good questions about the origin of the universe, questions about the historical Jesus. Instead, at the end, I said, what can Christians do better to reach skeptics? And this lady there, she said, listen. I said, what do you mean? She said, my Christian friends want to tell me what to believe, but they don't really listen. Then she said, if they don't listen to me, why should I bother to listen to them? And then this atheist guy, he said, stop the atheist jokes. I said, man, really? Because I've got some good ones. No, I'm just kidding. He used to be a Christian, and now he said he'll come and sit in the back of a church oftentimes, unbeknownst to people, and just watch. He said, almost every time I go, there's a cheap shot or a joke against atheists or some other non-Christian group. I remember thinking, this guy's got a complex. Within a week or two, I'm in church, and the pastor tells an inappropriate, insulting joke that made me uncomfortable about atheists. My leg still hurts because my wife was at that event that night, and she grabbed my knee. She's like, see, that guy's right. We don't realize the way we often treat people who aren't Christians. More than anything else, we are called to love non-believers. That's what breaks down barriers and gives us a chance to speak truth. But this isn't a niceness contest, right? If it was, the Mormons would win, right? I mean, my Mormon friends are just the nicest people on the planet. Paul said, love speaks truth. And I threw some tough objections at you, didn't I, at times? Now, the question is, how do we answer them? Now, realize really quickly what strategies I use. Because I want to help young people. I want to help you see in conversation some of the ways that people control conversation. You notice things I did. You asked a question. You notice how many times I didn't even answer it? And that's where you lovingly say, hey, that's a really interesting point you said. Now, here was my question. Would you be willing to address it? Do that once or twice. If they don't address it, then you move on, right? You don't want to just keep calling them on it. Do you notice how many big words I dropped? I did quantum mechanics. I don't even remember the other big words that I dropped. But that makes you sit there and go, man, this guy must know something I don't. He must be really smart. And it makes you feel stupid a little bit, right? That was intentionally to make you feel a certain way and feel just kind of unprepared. I did that. Also, when you asked a question, I always flipped it back and asked many questions on you, right? Because I want the burden of proof on you, not on me. So in a conversation, there's certain tactics and strategies that are used, and it's important to be aware of those and navigate them fairly. Well, we got a few minutes left. I want to look at some of the questions that were brought up. Okay, let me start with this one. Remember at the beginning how I said the more we learn about science, the smaller the gaps become for God? You know what the truth is? It's the opposite. The more we have plumbed the depths of the tiniest cell to the depths of the universe, we see that David, who wrote 3,000 years ago in Psalms 19:1 and 2 is correct. The skies proclaim the glory of God. Day by day they spew forth speech. Night by night they display knowledge. So lady right there who was pestering me, what's your name? What is it? Cecilia was asking a great question. She's saying, wait a minute. Where did everything come from? Right? Look, there's an old joke among scientists where some scientists come to God and they say, God, we can do everything you can do. And God says, like what? They said, create life from non-life. Okay, God says, show me. They reach down, picks up some dust, and God says, wait a minute. Get your own dust. Where did the dust come from? Stars. Where did the stars come from? Some quantum fluctuations. Where did the quantum fluctuations come from? Eventually, there has to be a source that itself is uncaused that brings everything else into existence. Now, do I believe in the Big Bang? I agree with 3 of you. I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. You can't have a Big Bang without a Big Banger. There actually is a well-known atheist by the name of Kai Nielsen, and he was in a debate with a Christian who's a friend of mine. And this point came up, and the atheist said something that just stunned me. He said, if we're sitting here in a debate, and there's an explosion behind me, and you say, what was that? And I said nothing, you wouldn't believe me. I'm thinking, wait a minute. You're making the argument for the other side. If the universe began to exist, and we know that it did, there must be a cause for the universe that is outside of the universe, right? If matter, space, and time came into existence at a finite point in the past, there must have been a cause that was timeless, spaceless, not physical, really smart and powerful to bring it into existence. That sounds a lot like God. You know, the amazing thing is from my studies, and I'm working on a PhD in this, and I've studied comparative religions. All the ancient religious documents I can find assume the universe is eternal and had no beginning. There's one document that stubbornly says the universe had a beginning. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. And now scientists, by the way, up until the 20th century, the scientific evidence was neutral. We couldn't prove it. Then in the 20th century, with the findings of Einstein, with the findings of Hubble, with the multiple other findings like what's called the microwave background radiation, we realized that the universe had a beginning. Well, if the universe had a beginning, it had to have a beginner. That's not blind faith. That's a reasonable inference from what we know about the way things work. Are you with me? Now, I could give other scientific ones, but let's take a step back and look at some of the other objections that I threw out at you. Okay? What about the historical Jesus? Who raised the question about Josephus? I think it was the fellow in the back. Here's the interesting thing. Whenever people ask me, they say, can you give me any evidence outside the Bible that shows Jesus existed? I'll say, wait a minute. How come the Bible doesn't count as evidence for the historical Jesus? I mean, if somebody said, how do we know Tacitus existed? Give me non-Roman evidence. You'd say, well, wait a minute. Why should I discount Romans if those are some of the early sources that we have? We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 testimonies, even though they may have used Matthew and Luke may have used Mark to a degree, but they're independent testimonies. We have the letters of Paul. We have early Christians like Clement of Rome writing in the end of the 1st century, attesting that Jesus existed. There's almost no reputable scholars that doubt the existence of Jesus. Now, I threw something at you about Josephus you hadn't heard before. Josephus was a Jew, and he wrote towards the end of the 1st century and the early 2nd century. And it's true that if you read the section about Jesus, it seems he's talking one area, and then out of context comes this reference to Jesus, and he goes on. But realize something. Ancients did not write with footnotes. We put footnotes below on the bottom of a page when it seems to be out of context. They would just include it in the way that they normally write, and Josephus did this all the time. But second, yes, probably a Christian went in and it's called interpolation. They exaggerated what Josephus said. So probably what Josephus originally said was not Jesus was the Messiah, but it was believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Josephus didn't say Jesus was risen on the 3rd day. He probably said it was believed that Jesus was risen on the 3rd day. And besides, there's a second writing in Josephus where he talks about Jesus as well. So for somebody that had no money, no political power, no military might, wrote no books, lived 150, didn't travel more than 150 years, and his public ministry was 2 to 3 years, the fact that anybody talked about this guy is unbelievable. And when you look at the Caesar that lived during the time of Jesus, do you know within 150 years of his death, there's 10 sources that mention him. The historical Jesus, there's 42, 9 of them which are secular. There's more evidence for the existence and basic life of Jesus than I think any other ancient figure, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. And I don't know a lot of Julius Caesar skeptics or Alexander the Great doubters. I think people doubt Jesus because of the powerful words that he spoke. Now, I threw a bunch of objections at you. Which are the ones that I throw at you want me to make sense of really quickly? I threw a lot, and I don't want to forget to answer some of these. What are the big questions that came up? Yes? Okay, triune God, excellent, thank you. I have no answer. I'm just kidding. Okay, here's the deal. Listen very carefully. What I did is misrepresent the Trinity, and then I shot it down. We believe, listen very carefully, and I can't go into this in 3 minutes, but Christians have very carefully formulated the doctrine of the Trinity. It says in the New Testament there's one God. Jesus asked, what's the greatest commandment of the law in Mark 12? And he says, the Lord our God is one. But what we find is that Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit, who are different persons, each share that divine nature. So when we're talking about the Trinity, I'm not saying there's one God and 3 gods. I'm not saying there's one person and 3 persons. There is one God who eternally exists as 3 persons. Now, there is no contradiction in that. There's none. So the way I put it is there is one what and 3 whos. There's one what and 3 whos. So look, in your church, there's one church, but there's multiple members. There's one family, and there's multiple members. There's one team, and there's multiple members. Now, that's not perfect as a relation to the Trinity, but there is one God in substance and 3 persons who share that divine nature. Now, I don't think we need to find an example in nature to explain the Trinity. I was asking my students in class, come up with an example of 3 in 1, and they're like, 3-leaf clover, a fan, and one kid goes, oh, Mr. McDowell, I got it, a peanut M&M. The chocolate, the peanut, and the shell. I stopped and I said, okay, we're trying to explain the eternal, self-existent, all good, all-knowing God, and you compare it to a peanut M&M. I can't explain to you the depth of God's character, but you know what? That's one reason I think it's true. Now, I didn't say it's illogical. I believe in the Trinity because that's how the Scriptures reveal it, and I think the Scriptures are true. But if I could fully encapsulate and explain the character of God, I would tend to think it's something human beings have made up. But instead, I look at it and I go, man, there's something beautiful about the character of God. In fact, you know what it tells us? Here's something that's just interesting to me. The Bible said God is love. The Quran says God is loving. Do you know what the difference is? You can only have love if you have a lover and what else? Not a lovey, somebody said. Dear Lord. A beloved, right? Oh my gosh. You have a lover and a beloved, distinct persons, one to give and one to receive love. Well, think about it. Within the character of the eternal God, there is relationship as a part of God's character. Muslims, my Muslim friends will say their Trinity is false. There's one person. So Allah can only love once Allah creates. So unique to Christianity is that God is relational in his very being. And when we become Christians, we are entered into the fellowship with the perfect, loving God who is relational by his very nature. That's unbelievable, and it's unique to Christianity. So does that at least make sense without going into more depth that the scriptures teach this? I think the scriptures are true. It's not illogical. We can show it's not irrational, and it makes sense of what Jesus taught and Jesus lived. Other ones, now here's a quick answer. I threw the problem of evil at you. Now, I'm actually going to give an entire seminar on this at 2 or 3 o'clock. I don't remember which one it'll be, in the afternoon on Sunday. Let me just tell you, with my friends that are not believers, this is one of the most persistent objections that I hear. And it's not just a logical issue, it's emotional. Right? We look at the things in the world, and all of us at some point and cried out and said, man, God, why don't you stop this? That's a human question. It's one that Job asked. Habakkuk asked it. David asked it. Now, the only piece I can give you now, and I think you spoke it out, somebody up here said it, is God had a choice. He could make us always do good, but then we would be robots and we could never love. Or God can make us with free will, and we can choose to love. But if you have the choice to love, you have the choice to not love. And God thought it was worth it. And all the pain in the world does not trump the ultimate good. We're going to go into depth on that, and I would really invite you to come and think about this, because this comes up so often amongst many of our skeptical friends. Now, I got about 4 or 5 minutes left. Tell me the other ones I threw at you, because I don't want you to wake up at midnight and all of a sudden have an existential crisis and walk away from your faith. That is not my point. What's that? Creation of man out of nothing? Oh, yeah. Okay, interesting enough. Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, he says, listen very carefully. I contradicted myself. I was hoping some of you would catch me on it. He says the laws of physics can explain the origin of the universe. What did I say about the laws of physics before Planck's time? They break down. So I said, yes, we can rely upon the laws of physics, but the law of physics don't apply. Were you listening carefully? Every worldview except Christianity at some point will contradict itself. Every worldview at some point. So what happens, Lawrence Krauss, a philosopher, and Stephen Hawking, to say something comes from nothing, they change what is meant by nothing. So in physics, you can use nothing to refer to a vacuum where there's empty space, but that's still something. When you and I mean nothing, we mean no thing. You can't get something from no thing. In fact, nothing, Aristotle said, is what rocks dream about. You can't get something from nothing. That's worse than magic, because at least in magic, there's a rabbit, there's a magician and there's a hat. They pull the rabbit from. We're talking about something from nothing. So I used fancy words. I drew implications from quantum mechanics that cannot logically be drawn from it. Okay? Maybe one more. What else did I miss any? You know what? Christian's testimony, I'll tell you something. It's always interesting for me when I'm in this position for somebody to stand up and just say, you can argue this fancy stuff, but Jesus has changed my life. Okay, listen for a second. I think that can be powerful. Don't hesitate to share. Don't exaggerate. But if Jesus has done something in your life, share it. My dad always says to me, he says, son, a man with an argument is at the mercy of a man with an experience. Now listen carefully though. If all we do is give our experience, then number one, we're not following the example of Paul and Jesus, who gave evidences and reasoned with people, but then we're no different than anybody else who has an experience. So share your experience because it's powerful and say, you know why I think this experience is true? Because I have reason to believe God exists. I have reason to believe the Bible's true. And fulfilled prophecy, by the way, I think fulfilled prophecy is powerful. Now, some of the prophecies are more clear than others are. So when it came to Bethlehem, could they have written that back in later and exaggerated it? Well, it's hard to make up where somebody was born, right? You can't really control that. And if Christians start saying he's born in Bethlehem, in the latter part of the first century, there still would have been people around who would have corrected this and said, no, Jesus, he wasn't born there. He was born elsewhere. Nobody says that. Nobody does. But second, yes, casting of the clothes, but there's certain things it's really hard for them to make up. Right? When it talks about Jesus being pierced, when Isaiah 53 talks about him being killed for our transgressions, there are some particular fulfilled prophecies that they couldn't just make up and have fit. Okay, so I think fulfilled prophecy is actually quite significant and a good piece of historical evidence for the person of Jesus. But we got to go back and understand the context and what is said in some of the particulars. All right, any last one? Can I just do one more? Okay.
Don't forget when Isaiah was written, there was no Rome.
Yeah, Isaiah was written about 800 BC. Rome did not exist yet, long before the time of Rome. Okay? So before crucifixion, and even in the Psalmist, 300 years before that, in Psalm 22:16, when he talks about being pierced, that was before they had anything like crucifixion. True.
And then biblical text, you mentioned you just don't believe the Bible. So why would we believe it?
Oh yeah, I mentioned I don't believe in the Bible. This, I mean, the quick answer is this. I have conversations with some of my Mormon friends that I care about. I'm going this week to hang out with a great friend of mine. And I just ask them this question. I say, you want me to base your life on this book? What evidence is there that this book happened? Because the Book of Mormon tells a story about millions of people being in Americas, having battles, hidden plates, people dying in the hill Cumorah. There's not a shred of archaeological evidence that any of that ever happened. It's fiction. When it comes to the New Testament, holy cow, I was in Israel 3 years ago. I was at the Sea of Galilee. In fact, I was so moved, I got out of the boat and I walked on the water. I was in Caesarea. I went to Bethlehem, and I asked a friend of mine who is at Hebrew University. He's an archaeologist. I said, what do people here in Israel think about the historical Jesus? Because there's Jews who don't believe in Jesus, there's Muslims, there's skeptics. He said, I'll tell you, we don't agree on anything in Israel. But I'll tell you what everybody agrees on. The existence of Jesus and the basic facts surrounding his life. He said, it's just too obvious. And I said, then why do you think people don't believe? And here's his response worth thinking about. He said, I don't think it's a matter of the evidence. I think it's a spiritual issue that some people can't or are unwilling to see. So Jesus heals the blind man in John 9. And they keep asking him, the skeptical religious leaders at the time, they keep saying, who did this? He said, Jesus. They say, no, who did this? He says, Jesus. He keeps going. And they press him. Finally, he says, all I know is I was blind, but now I see. There is a spiritual component fighting for all of our souls. And Jesus, who's had more influence on the history of the world than anybody else, said, who do you say that I am? That's the question. Some spit at him, some called him a liar, some called him a drunk, or they fell on their knees and they called him Lord. And for me, I went through a period of questioning in my life, even though my dad, as Joshua Mcdowell, has spent his life defending it. When I looked at the historical evidence for the Bible, when I looked at the life and the person of Jesus, I started to realize there's something different about this guy. And this story rings true. And I chose to be a follower of Jesus and to give a testimony. Man, I would never look back. I would never look back. If you're not a believer and you're here, I'm guessing some of you might have gotten dragged here by a friend this weekend. If so, we're glad that you're here. Would you allow me to give something to you? See, my dad actually grew up in Union City, not too far from here, and he had a pretty tough background. His dad was a drunk. My dad was sexually abused 7 years. His older sister committed suicide. And my dad set out, because he was challenged, to disprove Christianity, to make a lot of money showing that it was false. Well, 6 months, a year into this, after traveling around the world reading ancient manuscripts, my dad came to the conclusion that Christianity was true. Became a Christian, and my dad's life has been absolutely transformed, and I've seen it continued through my life. Well, he ends up becoming a Christian, and he spent his life reading, writing, debating, and defending the Christian faith, and he wrote this book called More Than a Carpenter. What he did is he went into a hotel room in Chicago with yellow pads, wrote it over 24 hours. Now it's sold over 20 million copies. And it's simply, he said, if I could sit down with somebody over coffee and just explain why I think Jesus is God, the resurrection is true, and the Bible can be trusted, this is what I would say. It's an easy read. If you're here this weekend, I know you're at least open. Can I give this to you? If you're not a believer, don't pay me for it. It's a gift, just like grace. It's free. Not as good as grace, but that's what grace is like. And honestly, even if you don't buy it, at least you know what Christians believe and why we believe it. Would you give me an hour and a half or 2 hours of your life to just explore a book that everywhere I go, I meet people who say, even this morning, like 5 or 6 people said this book changed their life. 3 years ago, I helped my dad update it, and you could probably sit down in 2 hours and read it. So if you're a skeptic, meet me at the book table and just say, hey, I'm exploring this stuff. I'll sign it, and I would be honored to give it to you for free. Now, if you're not a skeptic and you have a friend who's a skeptic, you need to pay for it, or I'm going to go broke. All right? But that's when you might check out in the back. I wrote a book called Is God Just a Human Invention? So if you're sitting here going, man, I need to make a little bit more sense of these tough questions. How do I answer this? Essentially, everything I threw out at you was why I wrote this book. I've been role-playing atheism, and these questions would come up from Christians. I thought, I need to give them an answer, plus responding to these very prominent, loud atheists within culture. So we got the top questions. Some, how could God allow evil? How did the universe begin? Is there really evidence the soul exists? How is God a genocidal bully? Why Jesus instead of the flying spaghetti monster? That's an important question. So if you want to go a little bit deeper, this is normally $17. It's actually only $10 back there. It's cut down. In fact, it's so cheap, I'm going to buy a few while I'm at it. The science issue came up quite a bit. I wrote this book with a double PhD named William Dembski. He was frustrated. I had to explain a lot of stuff to him. I'm just kidding. And we basically took all these unbelievable scientific finds from the smallest cell to the depths of the universe. Not just in cosmology, we talked about all these other areas now are pointing towards the existence of an intelligent designer. Every Christian needs to know this. I read this and I get goosebumps. It's amazing. David was right about the skies proclaiming God. Easy one to read, won't be over your head. And the last one I did, in particular for students, is called the Apologetics Study Bible for Students. So it's a study Bible, but it's filled with notes, it's filled with sidebars, it's filled with answers to the top 120 questions that people ask. Open to this one. If God already knows what we need, then why pray? That's a good question. It also has my favorite question in here, which is, if God made everything good, then why is it wrong to smoke pot? You better have an answer for that, because non-believers are asking it. Jeremy, I'm way over, man. I'm going to get fired. I'm going to sneak back to my book table. Would love to meet you, answer more questions, and just thank you for having me. So, blessings.